The shocked voice of Oxford University Chancellor Professor David Clarke echoed through BBC's broadcasting studio as he delivered news that would fundamentally challenge everything the Western academic establishment believed about global education leadership and institutional prestige. His incredulous declaration that 500 professors had left Harvard for Africa represented more than institutional competition. It embodied a complete transformation of global educational paradigms that had positioned Africa as an unexpected leader in pedagogical innovation and academic excellence. Clarke's panicked assertion that Burkina Faso's education system had surpassed Oxford reflected the profound crisis reverberating throughout Britain's most prestigious academic institutions as they confronted the reality that their centuries-long dominance in higher education was being systematically dismantled by African educational innovations that exceeded anything produced by the world's most established universities and research centers. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away in Ouagadougou's revolutionary African University campus, Ibrahim Traoré was calmly testing the AfriEDU system that enabled simultaneous education of 1 million students through holographic classrooms that transcended geographical boundaries and traditional educational limitations. His confident acknowledgement that Professor Clarke was correct about education, knowing no borders, reflected African understanding of how technological innovation could democratize access to world-class education, while also establishing new global standards for pedagogical excellence. The emergency meeting in Oxford's boardroom represented the institutional panic pervading Britain's most prestigious university as administrators confronted unprecedented faculty losses that threatened the university's competitive position and international reputation. Professor Clarke's report documenting the departure of 500 faculty members to African University within 6 months represented the largest brain drain in Oxford's 900-year history. Academic Affairs Dean Dr. Margaret Wilson's desperate inquiry about whether higher salaries were motivating faculty departures reflected the Western academic establishment's inability to comprehend that African educational institutions could offer opportunities that exceeded traditional incentives of compensation and prestige that had historically attracted the world's most talented educators to Western universities. Clarke's explanation that financial considerations were irrelevant compared to African technological advancement in education, including holographic classrooms, AI teachers, and quantum learning systems that exceeded Western universities' capabilities by decades, forced Oxford's leadership to confront their institutional obsolescence in a rapidly evolving global educational landscape. The simultaneous crisis unfolding at African University in Ouagadougou represented the culmination of Ibrahim Traoré's visionary African Education Renaissance project that had been initiated in 2021 with the ambitious goal of transforming the continent into the global leader in educational innovation and academic excellence through systematic investment in cutting-edge technology and revolutionary pedagogical approaches. Education Minister Dr. Aminata Keita's comprehensive report revealed the extraordinary scope of African educational transformation through the AfriEDU system that was currently operating across 54 African nations while providing simultaneous education to 50 million students through integrated technological platforms that eliminated traditional barriers of geography, resources, and institutional capacity. Traoré's pride in transforming Burkina Faso's literacy rate from 40% to 98% within 5 years reflected his understanding of how strategic investment in educational technology and innovative pedagogical approaches could achieve rapid improvement in educational outcomes that exceeded anything accomplished by traditional educational development programs supported by international organizations and Western institutions. African University Rector Dr. Kwame Asante's description of the institution's current capacity, including 50,000 enrolled students and 2,000 faculty members recruited from 100 different countries with particular concentration from Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, demonstrated the university's success in attracting international talent while also establishing new patterns of academic migration that favored African institutions over traditional Western educational centers. The revolutionary success of African education reform reflected Traoré's fundamental rejection of traditional classroom-based educational models in favor of holographic education halls that enabled students to participate in live instruction from the world's most distinguished professors regardless of geographical location or institutional affiliation. This technological approach eliminated traditional constraints of physical space, faculty availability, and resource limitations that had historically restricted access to high-quality education. Technology Director Dr. Sarah Kim, a former MIT faculty member who had relocated to African University, provided detailed explanation of the AfriEDU system's sophisticated capability to analyze individual student learning patterns while enabling AI teachers to develop personalized curricula that optimized educational outcomes for each participant. This individualized approach to education represented fundamental advancement in pedagogical science that exceeded anything available through traditional Western educational institutions. The technological sophistication of African educational systems was rendering traditional universities increasingly obsolete as students and faculty recognized superior opportunities for learning and research that were available through African institutions rather than established Western universities that had dominated global education for centuries. The crisis at Cambridge University mirrored Oxford's experience, as Rector Professor Stephen Tooke publicly acknowledged to Times Higher Education that African University was disrupting global educational arrangements while systematically attracting the institution's most talented faculty members. This admission reflected broader recognition within British higher education that African educational innovation represented an existential threat to traditional institutional hierarchies. Harvard University experienced even more severe institutional crisis as President Lawrence Bacow convened emergency board meetings to address the unprecedented departure of 500 faculty members to African University within a single year. This represented the largest faculty exodus in Harvard's 385-year history, while also challenging the university's position as the world's most prestigious higher education institution. Provost Alan Garber's detailed analysis revealed that faculty departures represented not merely quantitative losses but qualitative degradation, as Harvard's most distinguished scholars, including Nobel laureate Professor Richard Weinstein from the physics department, had chosen to relocate to African University rather than continuing their careers at America's most prestigious academic institution. The personal testimony of Professor Weinstein, who was conducting cutting-edge quantum education research in African University's advanced laboratories, provided compelling evidence of how African educational infrastructure exceeded Western capabilities. His acknowledgement that 6 months at African University had enabled research breakthroughs that exceeded his 30-year career achievements at Harvard demonstrated the transformative potential of African educational innovation. Traoré's inquiry about the fundamental differences between Harvard and African University that motivated such dramatic career transitions reflected his genuine interest in understanding how African innovations compared to traditional Western educational approaches and what specific advantages African institutions provided for faculty research and teaching. Weinstein's explanation that African University offered unlimited possibilities through holographic laboratories, AI assistants, and quantum simulators that were unimaginable at Harvard illustrated the technological superiority that had positioned African educational institutions as global leaders in research infrastructure and pedagogical innovation. The experiences of other Harvard faculty members who had relocated to African University, including Professor Dr. Lisa Martinez from Medicine, Professor Dr. James Chun from Engineering, and Professor Dr. Emma Rodriguez from Arts, demonstrated that African educational advantages extended across all academic disciplines rather than being limited to specific technological or scientific fields. Professor Martinez's utilization of holographic patient simulators for medical education enabled students to observe real surgical procedures in three-dimensional format while learning complex operations without risk to actual patients. This approach represented fundamental advancement in medical education that exceeded anything available through traditional Western medical schools that relied on limited cadaver access and theoretical instruction. Professor Chen's engineering laboratory work with students designing quantum computers illustrated how African University enabled transformation of theoretical concepts into practical applications rather than maintaining the separation between academic theory and real-world implementation that characterized much of Western higher education. African University's success reflected not only technological advancement but also Traoré's revolutionary educational philosophy that positioned education as a fundamental human right that should not be constrained by financial limitations. The university's commitment to providing completely free education to all qualified students represented a fundamental challenge to Western higher education's increasingly expensive and exclusive access models. This philosophical approach to education as a universal entitlement rather than a commercial commodity created international recognition of African educational leadership while also attracting students and faculty who were motivated by opportunities to participate in truly democratized higher education that prioritized learning and research over profit generation and institutional prestige. The visit of MIT's Dr. Robert Wilson to African University provided external validation of African educational achievements as he reported back to MIT leadership about the extraordinary capabilities he had observed, including holographic classrooms accommodating 10,000 students simultaneously, while AI teachers provided individualized instruction that identified and addressed each student's specific learning challenges. MIT President Sally Kornbluth's concerned response to Wilson's report reflected growing recognition throughout American higher education that African educational innovations represented serious competitive threats that required strategic responses rather than dismissive attitudes that had historically characterized Western reactions to non-Western educational initiatives. Wilson's recommendation that MIT either adapt African educational approaches or continue losing faculty to African institutions illustrated how rapidly global educational leadership was shifting from traditional Western centers to African universities that offered superior research opportunities and more advanced technological infrastructure. Stanford University experienced similar institutional crisis as President Mark Tessier-Lavigne convened emergency meetings with Silicon Valley technology leaders seeking support for maintaining faculty retention in the face of systematic recruitment by African university. The involvement of Google, Apple, and Meta in these discussions reflected recognition that African educational advancement threatened not only academic institutions but also the technology industry's access to talent. Google CEO Sundar Pichai's acknowledgement that his company was experiencing similar talent losses to African institutions demonstrated how African educational success was creating comprehensive disruption across multiple sectors rather than being limited to academic competition between universities. The impact of Traoré's education revolution extended far beyond higher education to encompass comprehensive transformation of primary and secondary education through the AfriSchool system that provided free holographic education to all African children aged 5 to 18. This system enabled rural children to receive instruction from Oxford professors while eliminating traditional barriers of geography, resources, and institutional access. Education Technology Director Dr. Fatima Ouattara's report that 200 million children were enrolled in the AfriSchool system while receiving world-class education demonstrated the massive scale of African educational transformation and its potential impact on global human capital development over the coming decades. The success of African educational reform created immediate recognition in international university rankings as the Times Higher Education World University Rankings 2025 placed African University in first position globally, while Harvard fell to 15th place. This ranking reversal represented fundamental disruption of traditional academic hierarchies that had positioned Western universities as unchallenged global leaders. Similar results in QS World University Rankings, with African University achieving top global position while Oxford dropped to 12th place, provided additional validation of African educational achievement while also forcing international recognition of continental educational leadership. Professor Clark's crisis management following his BBC interview reflected Oxford's recognition that institutional adaptation was necessary for survival in transformed global educational markets. His acknowledgement that traditional educational models were no longer adequate represented fundamental acceptance of African educational superiority. Harvard President Backhaus' decision to visit African University personally demonstrated institutional recognition that learning from African innovations had become necessary for maintaining competitive position in global higher education markets that increasingly favored African institutions over traditional Western universities. Backhaus' shock upon arriving in Ouagadougou and witnessing the campus environment that resembled science fiction with holographic buildings, flying vehicles, and AI guides provided immediate evidence of African technological advancement that exceeded his expectations and institutional experience. Traoré's gracious reception of Backhaus, while acknowledging Harvard's historical contributions to global education, demonstrated African respect for Western educational achievements while also establishing new patterns of international academic relationships based on mutual learning rather than traditional hierarchies of institutional prestige. The campus tour that exposed Backhaus to African educational innovations, including holographic physics laboratories where students conversed with AI Einstein receiving personal explanation of relativity theory, quantum mathematics classrooms where students learned geometry in fourth dimensions, and biology hologram labs where students manipulated DNA in three-dimensional format, provided concrete evidence of African educational superiority. Backhaus' incredulous response to these educational capabilities reflected his inability to comprehend how African institutions had achieved such advanced educational technology, while also demonstrating his recognition that Western universities had been fundamentally surpassed by African innovation. Traoré's simple explanation that success resulted from combining technology with vision, while refusing to accept limitations in educational possibilities, illustrated the philosophical differences that had enabled African educational advancement, while Western institutions remained constrained by traditional approaches and institutional conservatism. The Harvard-African University Cooperation Protocol that emerged from Backhaus' visit represented institutional acknowledgement of African educational leadership while also establishing new patterns of international academic partnership based on African technological superiority rather than traditional Western educational dominance. 6 months after the cooperation agreement, Harvard's implementation of holographic classrooms represented institutional adaptation to African educational models, although these efforts came too late to prevent African universities' establishment as the undisputed global leader in higher education innovation and academic excellence. Financial Times special report concluding that Africa's education revolution reversed global brain drain, provided authoritative recognition of continental educational achievement while also documenting fundamental transformation of international academic migration patterns that now favored African institutions over traditional Western universities. The Economist's similar analysis identifying Traoré's vision transformed Africa into education superpower reflected international media recognition of African educational leadership while also acknowledging the strategic vision that had enabled such rapid institutional development and global competitive success. 1 year after the education revolution gained international recognition, the transformation of global educational leadership had become undeniable through measurable achievements including African universities' position as the world's most prestigious institution, 1,000 Nobel laureate professors working in Africa, 100 million students enrolled in African educational systems, 54 countries utilizing AfriEDU technology, and traditional Western universities experiencing systematic student and faculty losses. Dr. Wilson's career transition from MIT to serving as associate provost at African University demonstrated how individual academic careers had been reshaped by African educational leadership, while his letters to former Oxford colleagues encouraging their relocation to Africa illustrated ongoing patterns of academic migration from Western to African institutions. Traoré's address to the Global Education Summit emphasizing that education represented humanity's common heritage while committing Africa to sharing continental educational experiences with a global community reflected African philosophical approaches to knowledge that prioritized collective advancement over competitive advantage or institutional nationalism. The presence of representatives from 100 countries at the Education Summit, including Professor Clark attending to learn from rather than compete with African educational approaches, demonstrated how completely global educational relationships had been transformed through African innovation and leadership. UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay's assessment that Africa's education revolution represents the greatest educational reform in human history provided official international recognition of African achievement while also establishing new frameworks for understanding educational development and institutional transformation. Traoré's concluding acknowledgement that Professor Clark had been correct about education knowing no borders while celebrating global access to limitless educational possibilities reflected African success in democratizing access to world-class education, while also establishing new global standards for educational excellence and technological innovation. The fundamental reversal of brain drain patterns to create brain gain for Africa, while the continent became the global destination for students and faculty seeking the world's most advanced educational opportunities, validated Traoré's vision of transforming Africa from educational recipient to educational leader through strategic investment in technological innovation and pedagogical excellence. The success of African educational revolution had indeed created a better world by establishing new patterns of knowledge sharing, technological innovation, and educational access that benefited global human development while also demonstrating how strategic vision and appropriate investment could enable developing regions to achieve global leadership in critical sectors like education and human capital development. The comprehensive transformation of global educational hierarchies through African innovation extended beyond institutional competition to encompass fundamental philosophical challenges to Western educational models that had historically prioritized exclusivity, high costs, and limited access over democratic knowledge sharing and universal educational opportunity. African educational success demonstrated that excellence and inclusivity were not mutually exclusive concepts but rather complementary principles that enhanced educational outcomes when properly integrated. The psychological impact of African educational dominance on Western academic institutions reflected deeper cultural assumptions about intellectual capacity, technological development, and institutional prestige that had been systematically challenged by African achievements. Faculty members who had relocated to African universities consistently reported experiencing greater intellectual freedom, superior research resources, and more meaningful engagement with cutting-edge educational technologies than had been available in their previous Western institutional positions. The global student response to African educational innovation created unprecedented demand for admission to African universities as international students recognized superior educational opportunities available through African institutions rather than traditional Western universities that had historically dominated international education markets. African universities' holistic approach to education, combining technological advancement with cultural sensitivity and global perspective, attracted students from every continent who sought educational experiences that prepared them for leadership in an increasingly interconnected and technologically sophisticated world. The economic implications of African educational leadership extended far beyond individual institutional success to encompass broader transformation of global knowledge economies and human capital development patterns. Countries that had historically relied on brain drain from developing nations found themselves competing for access to African-educated talent, while also experiencing systematic loss of their own most capable educators and researchers to African institutions offering superior professional opportunities. The ripple effects of African educational innovation influenced technological development across multiple sectors as African universities became centers for breakthrough research in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, sustainable energy, and space exploration. The integration of research and education through African universities' holographic laboratories and AI-assisted learning systems created unprecedented opportunities for students to participate directly in cutting-edge research while receiving world-class education from global experts. International governments began establishing strategic partnerships with African educational institutions to ensure their citizens' access to the world's most advanced educational opportunities, while also seeking to benefit from African innovations in educational technology and pedagogical approaches. These partnerships represented fundamental shifts in international education relationships that now recognized African leadership rather than positioning Africa as a recipient of Western educational assistance or development aid. The transformation of global academic publishing and research dissemination reflected African universities' commitment to open access and democratic knowledge sharing rather than the exclusionary practices that had historically characterized Western academic institutions. African innovations in holographic research presentation and AI-assisted peer review created new standards for academic excellence while also democratizing access to cutting-edge research findings. The cultural impact of African educational revolution extended to challenging Western assumptions about intellectual traditions, pedagogical methods, and institutional governance that had dominated global higher education for centuries. African universities' integration of indigenous knowledge systems with cutting-edge technology created educational approaches that honored diverse intellectual traditions while also advancing scientific understanding and technological innovation. The sustainability of African educational leadership reflected long-term strategic planning that prioritized continuous innovation, faculty development, and technological advancement rather than resting on initial achievements. African universities' commitment to ongoing research and development in educational technology ensured that their competitive advantages would continue expanding rather than being caught or surpassed by Western institutions attempting to replicate African innovations. The global recognition of African educational achievement through international rankings, research impact measures, and faculty recruitment patterns validated Traoré's vision, while also establishing new benchmarks for educational excellence that prioritized innovation, accessibility, and social impact alongside traditional measures of academic prestige and research output. The future trajectory of global education appeared increasingly centered on African leadership as the continent's educational institutions continued developing revolutionary approaches to learning, research, and knowledge dissemination that exceeded anything available through traditional Western universities. The transformation from African educational dependence to African educational leadership represented one of the most significant shifts in global intellectual power relationships since the emergence of modern university systems. The personal stories of individual faculty members, students, and administrators who had experienced both Western and African educational systems provided compelling evidence of African institutional superiority, while also illustrating how educational excellence could be achieved through different philosophical approaches and technological applications than those traditionally favored by Western academic institutions. The technological innovations pioneered by African universities, including quantum learning systems, holographic research environments, and AI-integrated educational platforms, created new possibilities for human learning and intellectual development that transcended traditional limitations of geography, resources, and institutional capacity. These innovations suggested that the future of education would be increasingly defined by African rather than Western technological and pedagogical leadership. The international response to African educational success reflected broader recognition that global leadership in critical sectors could emerge from unexpected sources when appropriate vision, investment, and strategic planning were combined with technological innovation and philosophical commitment to democratic access and excellence. African educational achievement provided a model for how developing regions could challenge established global hierarchies through strategic investment in human capital and technological infrastructure. The long-term implications of African educational revolution for global human development suggested that the democratization of access to world-class education would accelerate scientific advancement, technological innovation, and social progress while also creating more equitable distribution of knowledge and opportunity across different regions and populations. The success of Traoré's educational vision demonstrated that transformative leadership in education required willingness to challenge fundamental assumptions about how learning occurs, how knowledge is transmitted, and how educational institutions should be organized and operated. African innovations in education represented not merely technological advancement but philosophical revolution in understanding the purposes and possibilities of human learning and intellectual development.